Hey everybody. This is a section from the book The Trotsky Reappraisal, edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. Uh, this particular article is by Robert V. Daniels, of course, of the Conscience of the Revolution, the book he wrote. Uh, this piece is titled Trotsky's Conception of the Revolutionary Process. So here we go. Half a century after the death of Trotsky, with the idea of communism in full retreat everywhere, it is difficult to consider revolutionary leaders as anything but misguided fanatics. Yet Trotsky stands out uniquely among major revolutionaries in articulating a broad theory of the nature of revolution pari passu with his own political career. Pari passu is a Latin phrase that means with equal step or on equal footing. It is used to describe situations where multiple parties are treated equally without preference. So I guess in this case it would be Trotsky's political life and his theoretical life. Back to the text. Obviously, much of what Trotsky had to say, especially after the Soviet regime was established, was for purposes of polemics or self-justification. Nevertheless, Trotsky was making a serious effort to understand the events in which he was involved and by which he was ultimately destroyed. The aim of this chapter is to weigh the merit of that effort and to assess the validity of the insights Trotsky had into the course of the Russian Revolution, measured against the nature of the revolutionary process as it is more broadly known to history. My contention is that in endeavoring to come to terms with the peculiarities of revolution in Russia, Trotsky transcended the limitations of his Marxist faith and approached, step by step, the conception of revolution as a long but interconnected process of political and social change. The theory of revolution as such a process was widely developed by numerous Western writers during the first 2 decades following the Russian Revolution, after the upheaval in Russia impressed upon them its parallels with the French Revolution. Robert Lansing, American Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson, foresaw Russia, quote, first, moderation, second, terrorism, third, revolt against the new tyranny, and restoration of order by arbitrary military power, end quote. Footnote. Robert E. Lansing, War Memoirs. Robert F. Lansing, War Memoirs, Wikipedia says Robert Lansing lived from 1864 to 1928 and was an American lawyer and diplomat who served as the 42nd United States Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson from 1915 to 1920. As counselor to the State Department and then as Secretary of State, Robert Lansing was a leading advocate for American involvement in World War I. Robert Lansing was born and raised in Watertown, New York, where Robert Lansing joined his father's law firm after graduating from Amherst College. After developing expertise in international law and marrying the daughter of Secretary of State John W. Foster, Robert Lansing served as associate counsel to the United States delegations to the Bering Sea arbitration and Bering Sea claims before arguing the United States case before the Alaska Boundary Tribunal in 1903. As a conservative, pro-business voice in the Democratic Party, Robert Lansing was appointed by Woodrow Wilson as counselor to the State Department under Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan. When Bryan resigned on the 8th of June 1915 over Wilson's policy toward Germany, Robert Lansing was elevated to succeed him. As Secretary of State, Robert Lansing was a strong advocate for the United States' role in establishing international law and an avowed critic of German autocracy and Russian Bolshevism. Before U.S. involvement in the war, Lansing vigorously advocated freedom of the seas and the rights of neutral nations. Robert Lansing later advocated U.S. participation in World War I, negotiating the Lansing-Ishii Agreement with Japan in 1917, and was a member of the American Commission to Negotiate Peace at Paris in 1919. However, Woodrow Wilson made Colonel House his chief foreign policy advisor because Robert Lansing privately opposed much of the Treaty of Versailles and was skeptical of the Wilsonian principle of self-determination. And the book that was cited says, "The War Memoirs of Robert Lansing, Secretary of State, is a book written by Robert Lansing, an American lawyer and statesman who served as the Secretary of State during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. The book is a first-hand account of Lansing's experiences during World War I and Lansing's role in shaping American foreign policy during that time. Lansing's memoirs cover a wide range of topics, including his early career as a lawyer, his appointment as the counselor to the State Department in 1914, and Lansing's eventual promotion to Secretary of State in 1915. Robert Lansing also discusses Robert Lansing's interactions with other key figures of the time, such as President Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and French Premier Georges Clemenceau. Throughout the book, Robert Lansing provides insights into the diplomatic efforts and negotiations that took place during World War I, including the negotiations leading up to the Treaty of Versailles. He also offers his opinions on major issues of the time, such as the League of Nations, the Russian Revolution, and the role of the United States in the world. Overall, the War Memoirs of Robert Lansing, Secretary of State, is a valuable historical document that provides a unique perspective on the events and issues of World War I. It is a must-read for anyone interested in American foreign policy, international relations, and the history of the 20th century. This scarce antiquarian book... this is just about the actual material of the book that's being sold. So, back to the text and footnote. The notion of revolution as a natural sequence of distinct stages, punctuated by violence, was given academic form by the American church historian Lyford P. Edwards. Footnote. Lyford P. Edwards, The Natural History of Revolution. Wikipedia says, The Natural History of Revolution is a sociology treatise written by the Reverend Lyford P. Edwards, an American Episcopalian priest, in 1927. The Natural History of Revolution formed part of the corpus of the Chicago School's work on the causes and effects of revolution. While The Natural History of Revolution was later overshadowed by other works on revolutionary sociology, notably Anatomy of Revolution by Crane Brinton. I think this book is about to actually be referenced in the text we're reading, who praised natural history as one, quote, of the best introductions to the subject available in English, end quote. It was seminal in elaborating upon the potential stages of revolution and the relationship between early moderates and radicals who may usurp the power of the revolution. Using the cases of the English, American, French, and Russian revolutions, Lyford P. Edwards theorized that revolutions were not the cause of social change, but merely one of the extreme symptoms of previously understated social change. Lyford P. Edwards was an Episcopal priest born in 1882 who was ordained at a time when there were close connections between the University of Chicago Divinity School and the Department of Sociology. Lyford P. Edwards came out of the influence of the theories of Robert E. Park, to whom he dedicated this work. Lyford P. Edwards taught at St. Stephen's College from 1920 to 1947. Back to the text and footnote. Following Edwards, the well-known historian Crane Brinton proposed a medical image of the phenomenon. Quote, "We shall regard revolutions ... as a kind of fever ... This works up, not regularly, but with advances and retreats, to a crisis, frequently accompanied by delirium ... Finally, the fever is over and the patient is himself again, perhaps in some respects actually strengthened by the experience, immunized at least for a while from a similar attack, but certainly not wholly made over into a new man." End quote. Crane Brinton. Footnote. Crane Brinton, The Anatomy of Revolution. The Wikipedia for Crane Brinton says, Crane Brinton lived from 1898 to 1968 and was an American historian of France as well as a historian of ideas. Crane Brinton's most famous work, The Anatomy of Revolution, likened the dynamics of revolutionary movements to the progress of fever. Born in Winsted, Connecticut, Crane Brinton's family soon moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, where Crane Brinton grew up and attended the public schools there before entering Harvard University in 1915. Crane Brinton's excellent academic performance enabled Crane Brinton to win a Rhodes Scholarship to attend Oxford University, receiving a Doctor of Philosophy degree in 1923. Crane Brinton then began teaching at Harvard University the same year, becoming full professor in 1942 and remaining at Harvard until his death. Crane Brinton was McLean Professor of Ancient and Modern History from 1946 to 1968. For many years, Crane Brinton taught a popular course at Harvard known informally to his students as, quote, Brunch with Brinton. Brinton was known for his witty, convivial, and urbane writing and commentary, and was fluent in French. During World War II, Crane Brinton was for a time Chief of Research and Analysis in London in the Office of Strategic Services. Crane Brinton was also Fire Marshal at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which withstood the Blitz with minor damages. After the war, Crane Brinton was commended by the United States Army for, quote, conspicuous contribution to the liberation of France, end quote, and was chairman of the Harvard Society of Fellows in the late 1940s. Membership during that period included McGeorge Bundy and Ray Klein, who would go on to become quite influential in national security and intelligence. In the early 1960s, Crane Brinton was the dissertation supervisor at Harvard of the young historian Will Johnston. Crane Brinton also served as an advisor for historian Elizabeth Eisenstein, author of The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. Crane Brinton was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1939 and the American Philosophical Society in 1953. In 1963, Crane Brinton was elected president of the American Historical Association. Crane Brinton was also president of the Society for French Historical Studies. On February 19, 1968, Crane Brinton testified at the Fulbright hearings on the Vietnam War as to the nature of the Vietnamese opposition, saying that Americans are sympathetic to a revolution, but not a communist one, and that if Ho Chi Minh had not been a communist, quote, the whole story would have been different, end quote. Crane Brinton wrote a review of Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, bracket, relevant question mark, bracket, citation needed. Among those scholars inspired were among those Crane Brinton's scholarship inspired were Samuel P. Huntington, who cited Crane Brinton many times in his book, Political Order in Changing Societies, bracket, citation needed, end bracket, and Robert Struble Jr. in his treatise on 12 Lights. And the Wikipedia I'm going to actually read this whole Wikipedia since it's about a book. The Anatomy of Revolution is a 1938 book by Crane Brinton outlining the, quote, uniformities of four major political revolutions: the English Revolution of the 1640s, the American, the French, and the Russian Revolution. Brinton notes how the revolutions followed a life cycle from the old order to a moderate regime to a radical regime to Thermidorian reaction. The Anatomy of Revolution has been called, quote, classic, quote, famous, and a, quote, watershed in the study of revolution, end quote, and has been influential enough to have inspired advice given to U.S. President Jimmy Carter by his National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski during the Iranian Revolution. It has been referenced in the well-known text Political Science and Introduction by Michael G. Roskin et al. A revised edition was published in 1952, and a revised expanded edition was published in 1965. The Anatomy of Revolution remains in print. Brinton summarized the revolutionary process as moving from, quote, financial breakdown to organization of the discontented to remedy this breakdown, ... revolutionary demands on the part of these organized discontented, demands which if granted would mean the virtual abdication of those governing, attempted use of force by the government, its failure, and the attainment of power by the revolutionists. These revolutionists have hitherto been acting as an organized and nearly unanimous group, but with the attainment of power it is clear that they are not united. The group which dominates these first stages we call the moderates. Power passes by violent methods from right to left, end quote. According to Brinton, while, quote, we must not expect our revolutions to be identical, end quote, three of the four, the English, French, and Russian, began, quote, in hope and moderation, end quote, reached, quote, a crisis in a reign of terror, end quote, and ended, quote, in something like dictatorship, Cromwell, Bonaparte, Stalin, end quote. The exception is the American Revolution, which, quote, does not quite follow this pattern, end quote. The revolutions begin with problems in the pre-revolutionary regime. These include problems functioning, quote, government deficits, more than usual complaints over taxation, conspicuous governmental favoring of one set of economic interest over another, administrative entanglements and confusions, end quote. There are also social problems such as the feeling by some that careers are not, quote, open to talents, end quote. And economic power is separated from political power and social distinction. There is a, quote, loss of self-confidence among many members of the ruling class, end quote. The, quote, conversion of many members of that class to the belief that their privileges are unjust or harmful to society, end quote. Quote, intellectuals, end quote, switch their allegiance away from the government. In short, quote, the ruling class becomes politically inept, end quote. Financial problems play an important role as, quote, three of our four revolutions started among people who objected to certain taxes, who organized to protest them, ... Even in Russia in 1917, the financial problems were real and important, end quote. The revolution's enemies and supporters disagree over whether plots and manipulations by revolutionists or the corruption and tyranny of the old regime are responsible for the old regime's fall. Brinton argues both are right, as both the right circumstances and active agitation are necessary for the revolution to succeed. At some point in the first stage of the revolutions, quote, there is a point where constituted authority is challenged by illegal acts of revolutionists, end quote, and the response of security forces is strikingly unsuccessful. In France in 1789, the, quote, king didn't really try, end quote, to subdue riots effectively. In England, the king, quote, didn't have enough good soldiers, end quote. In Russia, quote, at the critical moment, the soldiers refused to march against the people, end quote, and instead joined them. Revolutions, quote, are born of hope, end quote, rather than misery. Contrary to the belief that revolutionaries are disproportionately poor and down and out, quote, revolutionists are more or less a cross-section of common humanity, end quote. While revolutionaries, quote, behave in a way we should not expect such people to behave, end quote, this can be explained by the, quote, revolutionary environment, end quote, rather than their background. Quote, untouchables very rarely revolt, end quote. and successful slave revolutions, like Haiti's, are few in number, revolutions are, quote, not unprosperous, end quote, but revolutionaries are, quote, not unprosperous, end quote, but, quote, feel restraint, cramp, rather than downright crushing oppression, end quote. In each revolution, a short, quote, honeymoon, end quote, period follows the fall of the old regime, lasting until the, quote, contradictory elements, end quote, among the victorious revolutionaries assert themselves. Power then has a tendency, quote, to go from right to center to left, end quote. In the process, Brinton says, quote, the revolution, like Saturn, devours its children, end quote. Quoting Pierre Victorien Vergniaud. The revolutions being studied first produce a, quote, legal, moderate government. It vies with a more radical, quote, illegal government in a process known as, quote, dual power, or as Crane Brinton prefers to call it, quote, dual sovereignty, end quote. In England, the, quote, Presbyterian moderates in Parliament, end quote, were rivals of the, quote, illegal government of the extremist independents in the New Model Army, end quote. In France, the National Assembly was controlled by the, quote, Girondin moderates, end quote, while the Montagnard, quote, extremists controlled, quote, the Jacobin network, end quote, quote, the Paris Commune, end quote, and the societies of the Friends of the Constitution. In Russia, the moderate provisional government of the Duma clashed with the radical Bolsheviks, whose illegal government was a, quote, network of Soviets, end quote. The radicals triumphed because they're, quote, better organized, better staffed, better obeyed, end quote. The radicals have, quote, relatively few responsibilities, while the legal government, quote, has to shoulder some of the unpopularity of the government of the old regime, end quote, with, quote, worn out machinery of the institutions of the old regime, end quote. The moderates are hindered by their hesitancy to change direction and fight back against the radical revolutionaries, quote, with whom they recently stood united, end quote, in favor of conservatives, quote, against whom they have so recently risen, end quote. They are drawn to the slogan, quote, no enemies to the left, end quote. The moderates are attacked on one side by, quote, disgruntled but not yet silenced conservatives and the confident aggressive extremists, end quote. On the other, the moderate revolutionary policies can please neither side. An example is the Root and Branch Bill in the English Revolution, which abolished the episcopacy, angering conservatives, and established institutions without earning the loyalty of radicals. The moderates, quote, prove poor war leaders, end quote, of wars which accompany the revolutions, unable to, quote, provide the discipline, the enthusiasm, end quote, needed. In contrast to moderates, the radicals are aided by a fanatical devotion to their cause, discipline, and, in recent revolutions, a study of technique of revolutionary action, obedience to their leadership, ability to ignore contradictions between their rhetoric and action, and drive boldly ahead. Even their small numbers are an advantage, giving them, quote, the ability to move swiftly, to make clear and final decisions, to push through to a goal without regard for injured human dispositions, end quote. Radicals took power in Russia with the October Revolution, in France with the purge of the Girondins, in England, quote, Pride's Purge, end quote. The American Revolution never had a radical dictatorship and reign of terror, quote, though in the treatment of loyalists, in the pressure to support the army, in some of the phases of social life, you can discern, many of the phenomena of the terror as it is seen in our three other societies, end quote. The radical reign is one of, quote, terror and virtue, end quote. Terror stemming from the abundance of summary executions, foreign civil war, struggle for power, virtue in the form of puritanical, quote, organized asceticism, end quote, and suppression of vices such as drunkenness, gambling, and prostitution. In its ardor, revolutionary, quote, tragicomedy, end quote, touches the average citizen for whom, quote, politics becomes as real, as pressing, as unavoidable, as food and drink, end quote. Their, quote, job and the weather, end quote. On taking power, the radicals rule through dictatorship and, quote, rough and ready centralization, end quote. Quote, the characteristic form of this supreme authority is that of a committee, end quote. The Council of State in England, Committee of Public Safety in France. At some point in these revolutions, the, quote, process of transfer of power from right to left ceases, end quote, and groups even more radical than those in power are suppressed. In France, the Hébertists are sent to the guillotine. In Russia, the Kronstadt rebellion is crushed. At least in France and Russia, the accession of radicals is also accompanied by a decline in political participation measured in votes cast as, quote, ordinary, peaceful, end quote, humdrum men and women, end quote, favoring moderation, find no outlet for their political beliefs. Along with centralization, lethal force and suppression of opposition, rule by committees, radical policies include the spreading of, quote, the gospel of their revolution, end quote, to other countries. This is found not only in the Russian and French revolutions, but even 17th century England, where Edward Saxby, quote, proposed to the French radicals, end quote, in Bordeaux, quote, a republican constitution, which was to be called La Cour du Peuple, or the Court of the People, I don't know, an adaptation of the English Agreement of the People, end quote. These attempts seldom make a significant impact as the revolutionaries, quote, are usually too poor and too occupied at home, end quote. The radical reign of terror, or quote, crisis period, is fairly soon replaced by Thermidor period, a period of relaxation from revolutionary policies, or quote, convalescence from the quote, fever of radicalism. Thermidor is named for the period following the fall of Maximilien Robespierre in the French Revolution. In Russia, the new economic policy of 1921, quote, can be called Russia's Thermidor. And, quote, perhaps the best date, end quote, for that period in England is, quote, Cromwell's dissolution of the Rump, end quote. The Thermidor is characterized by the, quote, establishment of a, quote, tyrant, end quote, i.e., quote, an unconstitutional ruler brought to power by revolution, end quote. The, quote, silken threads of habit, tradition, legality, end quote, have been broken. Quote, men must be held together in society by the, quote, iron chains, end quote, of dictatorship, end quote. Restoration of many pre-revolutionary ways. In Russia, this meant an abandonment of the Bolsheviks' avant-garde stance against the institution of the family, formerly disparaged as, quote, a stuffy little nest breeding selfishness, jealousy, love of property, indifference toward the great needs of society, end quote. The Bolshevik regime restored roadblocks to divorce, laws against homosexuality, and moderated its anti-religious, anti-Eastern Orthodox Church stance. Reaction against Puritanism of the Revolution. In England, the Restoration comedy that appeared after the Revolution is now, quote, a symbol of naughtiness, end quote. In France, the post-revolutionary Directory era was known as boom time for reopened dance halls and swaggering jeunesse dorée, or dorée. During the new economic policy in the Soviet Union, advertising began to appear. As a new class of entrepreneurs known as the netmen, who were reputed to be, quote, exceptionally vulgar, profiteering, crude, and noisy, end quote. The replacement of, quote, missionary spirit, end quote, to spread revolution by, quote, an aggressive nationalism, end quote. In England, Cromwell reconquered Ireland and seized Jamaica. In France, Napoleon created an empire. America did not have a proper reign of terror and virtue, but, quote, the decade of the 1780s displays in incomplete form some of the marks of Thermidor, end quote, as evidenced by the complaint of historian J.F. Jameson that, quote, sober Americans of 1784 lamented the spirit of speculation which war and war's attendant disturbances had generated, the restlessness of the young, disrespect for tradition and authority, increase of crime, the frivolity and extravagance of society, end quote. Crane Brinton finds the lasting results of the revolutions disappointing. In France, the revolution did away with the, quote, old overlapping jurisdictions, the confusions and compromises inherited from the thousand-year struggle, end quote, between crown and feudal nobility, weights and measures, quote, that varied from region to region, indeed from town to town, end quote, were replaced by the metric system. Also gone was non-decimal coinage, unsuited, quote, for long division, end quote. Some antiquated practices were also eliminated in England. In Russia, the Bolsheviks brought industrialization and eventually the Sputnik space satellite. confiscated land stayed in the hands of the new owners for the most part, redistributing land to many, quote, small independent peasants, end quote, in France, and Puritan businessmen and clergymen in England. Remaining essentially, quote, untouched, end quote, were day-to-day social relations between husband and wife and children. Attempts at establishing new religions and personal habits came to naught. The revolution's, quote, results look rather petty as measured by the brotherhood of man and the achievement of justice on this earth. The blood of the martyrs seems hardly necessary to establish decimal coinage, end quote. Crane Brinton concludes that despite their ambitions, the political revolutions Crane Brinton studied brought much less lasting social change than the disruptions and changes of, quote, what is loosely called the Industrial Revolution, end quote, and the top-down reforms of Mustafa Kemal's reforms in Turkey and the Meiji Restoration or post-World War II MacArthur era in Japan. Limitations of the theory. 1. Brinton admits that, quote, revolution is one of the looser words, end quote. Must a revolution always be violent? Can revolution occur by consent as in the UK general election of 1945? Crane Brinton is unsure. 2. Crane Brinton assumes that the U.S. is, quote, a stable society in the midst of societies undergoing revolutionary change, end quote. Quote, the U.S. looks like a stable society in which a real revolution is highly unlikely, end quote. This is disputed then and later by, among others, Murray Friedman, Lee Edwards, Paul Craig Roberts, Bernard Sterncher, Mario Einaudi, Carl N. Degler, who wrote of the U.S. Civil War as a, quote, second American Revolution, and of the Great Depression as a third revolution. 3. Crane Brinton asserts that the, quote, Great Russian Revolution is quite over-finished, end quote. Also, quote, revolutions end in a return to an equilibrium, ... The stable Russian society should finally emerge, ... No longer in the midst of perpetual nightmare, ... Abundance seems on its way in the 1960s, end quote. Like most, Crane Brinton failed to notice the internal contradictions which caused the USSR's collapse just 20 years later. 4. Crane Brinton called his book, quote, a work of systemization still in its infancy, end quote. There was, quote, a necessity for a more rigorous treatment of the problems involved, ... Wider uniformities will, ... someday emerge from more complete studies, end quote. Crane Brinton admitted to a lack of objectivity, quote, absolute detachment is a polar region unfit for human life, end quote. 5. With reference to points 2 and 3 above, it is widely accepted that polities cannot always be on the rise in a stable fashion. See, for example, even Khaldun, Joshua S. Goldstein, Paul Kennedy, William Shearer, and Sakwa. Okay, back to the text and footnote. Thank you so much for listening to that extended detour. In the perspective of the process theory, revolution, this is back to the text. In the perspective of the process theory, revolution is not an event but a complex chain of causes and effects, as one state of affairs leads to another over a period of years. Footnote. I have developed this approach more fully elsewhere. See Robert V. Daniels' article, Whatever Happened to the Russian Revolution, published in Commentary, November 1978. End footnote. In contrast to a mere coup, a true revolution involves a general political breakdown. Did I say end footnote? In contrast to a mere coup, a true revolution involves a general political breakdown and a progression of violent action through discernible stages, from the moderate to the extreme, followed by a retreat and consolidation. A revolution of this sort is a profound structural crisis in the development of a country, typically brought on by a tempo of social change, that is, modernization, that a rigid traditionalist government cannot accommodate. Contrary to what all revolutionaries have assumed, revolution is not a plannable, elective political tactic available whenever they choose to resort to it, nor do its ultimate results necessarily or even usually conform to the intentions of those who endorse it. As Napoleon said, quote, "A revolution can be neither made nor stopped," end quote. Footnote, see J. Christopher Harold, The Mind of Napoleon, a selection from his written and spoken words, published in 1956. The description for this book, Mind of Napoleon, a selection of his writings and spoken words, edited by J. Christopher Harold, says, "This collection of written and spoken statements of Napoleon serves as a historical record or analysis, not as a historical record or analysis, but as insight into the mind and character of a fascinating historical figure. It demonstrates the luminous strength and almost supernatural power of Napoleon's mind, despite an exceptional energy in thought as well as action. The selections are edited and organized topically to offer a broad range of subjects, from, quote, the human heart to, quote, the art of war, and to establish a coherent, unified pattern providing a fresh perspective on the genius of Napoleon. The sources used fall into three categories. 1. Napoleon's writings, including autographed manuscripts and dictations of letters, orders, decisions, bulletins, proclamations, newspaper articles, memoirs, commentaries, etc. 2. Napoleon's oral opinions as given at the Conseil d'État, including stenographic transcripts, official minutes, and unofficial notes taken by various counselors. 3. Recorded conversations and reminiscences of Napoleon's contemporaries from about 1800 to 1821. Back to the text, end footnote. By the test of the process model, the Marxist theory of revolution, which the Russian Social Democrats, including Trotsky, took as their starting point, is entirely inadequate. Marxism makes much of revolution as the transfer of power from one class to another, but devotes little theoretical attention to the way revolutions actually unfold. Footnote, a good negative example is Karl Kautsky's The Materialist Conception of History, where revolution is mentioned often, but only in passing. End footnote. Can't find any description of The Materialist Conception of History by Karl Kautsky. Revolution, as the simple displacement of classes, is belied by the mix of social elements, interests, and ideas in every actual revolution. More importantly, classical Marxism misses the essential nature of revolution as a complex and extensive process. It offers no conception of the natural sequence of stages in the revolution. Further, Marxism misstates the causal conditions of revolution, seeing those conditions as the full development of the old social system. In Marx's famous words, quote, "No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed," end quote. Footnote, see Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, end footnote. Thus, the flowering of capitalism is believed to be the precondition for the next revolution, which is assumed without proof to be, quote, proletarian. Actually, history shows revolution to be most likely at an intermediate point in the modernization process, as it affects a given country, when the tempo of change is at its maximum and expectations have risen beyond the particular country's capacity to satisfy those expectations. It is not true, as Marx believed, that, quote, Mankind always takes up only such problems as it can solve, end quote. Revolutions invariably overreach beyond what the material conditions and psychological development of the given country will support, and hence must inevitably sooner or later go into retreat. It is a familiar paradox that Russian radicals were attracted to Marxism at the turn of the century by its quasi-scientific laws of progress towards utopia, despite the difficulty in applying the doctrine to a country deemed unready for proletarian revolution and socialism. The attraction was not logical but psychological, and psychology governed as well the ways in which different Russian Marxists addressed the problem of the waiting period between the still unachieved bourgeois revolution and the ultimate proletarian revolution. The Mensheviks, including most of the older leaders of the social democratic movement, were prepared to play the loyal opposition while Russia accomplished the requisite capitalist development, a position of correct Marxism but of fatal politics, as matters turned out. Lenin and his Bolsheviks, determined to lead the workers to power without delay, bent their Marxism to fit their own psychic requirements, by asserting that the proletariat would have an immediate role in taking over the bourgeois revolution from its weak middle-class sponsors and then presiding over the country while economic development caught up with the political. Lenin was never one to acknowledge his revisions of Marx, but in his 1905 vision of the workers taking over the bourgeois democratic revolution, quote, when the bourgeoisie recoils from it and then the masses of the peasantry come out as active revolutionaries side by side with the proletariat, end quote, to create the, quote, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, end quote. Lenin was in fact beginning to recognize revolution as a complex, multi-stage process, a process, moreover, which could carry the political regime to a point beyond that which the socio-economic stage of the country would normally sustain. Footnote. See Lenin's The Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution. End footnote. It fell to Trotsky to carry this modification of the Marxian conception of revolution to a bold new statement of the complex revolutionary process in Russia. This was Trotsky's famous, quote, theory of permanent revolution, end quote, or, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote, as Trotsky himself originally styled it, which he worked out first as a participant observer of the events of 1905, and then during the leisure of imprisonment following the revolution of 1905. Footnote. Published as Results and Prospects in Our Revolution, St. Petersburg, 1906. English translation in Our Revolution, 1918. Where am I? The more confusing term, quote, permanent revolution, was applied to the theory by later commentators, but it stuck and Trotsky accepted it. See Burt Kneipp-Paz's book, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. On Trotsky's earlier steps in formulating the theory, see Michael Louvy, The Theory of Permanent Revolution. In Pensiero e Azione di Lev Trotsky. One moment, please. End footnote. Prompted by his friend of those years, the German Social Democrat Alexander Helphand, alias Parvis. Trotsky undertook to assess the social forces which had manifested themselves in Russia in that abortive upheaval and to justify an immediate radical role of the workers. Footnote: see Z.A.B. Zeman and W.B. Charlau, The Merchant of Revolution, The Life of Alexander Helphand Parvis, published in 1867 to 1924, published in 1965. Is there any kind of... I'm trying to see if there's a description of this book. I am not seeing it. Yeah, sorry, I'm not seeing that book. End footnote. I'm going to read Parvis's Wikipedia page. Alexander Parvis lived from 1867 to 1924, and sometimes called Helphand in the literature on the Russian Revolution, was a Marxist theoretician, publicist, and controversial activist in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Israel Lazarovich Gelfand was born to a Lithuanian Jewish family on the 8th of September 1867 in the shtetl of Berezino in the Russian Empire in present-day Belarus. Although little is known of Israel's early childhood, the Gelfand family belonged to the lower middle class, with his father working as an artisan of some sort, perhaps as a locksmith or as a blacksmith. When Israel was a small boy, a fire damaged the family's home in Berezino, prompting a move to the city of Odessa, Russian Empire, present-day Ukraine, the hometown of Israel's paternal grandfather. Gelfand attended gymnasium in Odessa and received private tutoring in the humanities. Gelfand also read widely on his own, including material by the iconic Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, the journalist Nikolai Mikhailovsky, and the political satirist Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin, which led the young Gelfand to begin to question the legitimacy of the Tsarist Empire. In 1886, the 19-year-old Gelfand, I'm just going to say Parvis whenever it says another name, just to keep track. Parvis first traveled from Russia to Basel, Switzerland. It was there that Parvis was first exposed to the writings of Alexander Herzen as well as the revolutionary literature of the day. Parvis returned to Russia briefly the following year, but Parvis became the subject of official scrutiny by the Tsarist secret police and was forced to leave the country again for his safety. Parvis would remain abroad for more than a decade. Returned to Switzerland in the autumn of 1888, Parvis enrolled at the University of Basel, where he studied political economy. Parvis would remain at the university for the next 3 years, graduating with a doctorate degree in 1891. Is that also where Rosa Luxemburg went? She had like a doctorate, I think, from a university in Switzerland. I'm not sure though. Parvis's professors were largely hostile to Parvis's Marxist approach to economics, however, and difficulty in his oral examination resulted in a rider being attached to the degree, which rendered it the equivalent of a third-class degree. Parvis chose not to pursue an academic career, but rather sought to begin a political career which would both provide Parvis financial support and serve the cause of socialism. Alienated from the backwardness of agrarian Russia and the limited political horizons there, Parvis moved to Dresden, in Germany, joined the Social Democratic Party, and took over the editorship of the socialist newspaper Sächsische Arbeiterzeitung. Parvis enlisted the German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg as a contributor. From the 20th of January to the 6th of March 1898, Parvis used his newspaper to run a series of polemical articles attacking the German Marxist Edward Bernstein, who had queried Marxist predictions that the collapse of capitalism was inevitable and advocated a nonviolent advocated nonviolent reforms as the route to socialism, giving Parvis's series the title Bernstein's Overthrow of Socialism. Parvis attacked Bernstein in personal terms as someone who had deserted Marxism. Parvis was in a minority within the SPD, most of whose leaders were shocked by his intemperate language, but he was backed by Rosa Luxemburg and the leading Russian Marxist, Georgy Plekhanov. On the 25th of September 1898, Parvis and Parvis's assistant editor, Yulian Marhlevsky, were expelled from Saxony and settled in Munich, handing control of Sächsische Arbeiterzeitung to Rosa Luxemburg. In Munich, Parvis founded the publishing house that introduced the work of Maxim Gorky to Germany. In 1900, Parvis met Vladimir Lenin for the first time. In Munich, each admiring the other's theoretical works. Parvis encouraged Lenin to begin publishing his revolutionary paper, Iskra. Parvis's attempts to become a German citizen proved fruitless. Parvis once commented in a letter to his German friend, Wilhelm Liebknecht, that, quote, "I am seeking a government where one can inexpensively acquire a fatherland," end quote. After the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, Parvis wrote a series of articles for Iskra, beginning in February 1904, in which Parvis forecast the decline of the nation-state as capitalist competition made states more interdependent, that there would be a series of wars as states fought, and that there would be a political upheaval in Russia that would, quote, "shake the bourgeois world," end quote, for survival. Shortly after Bloody Sunday, when troops fired on a peaceful crowd in St. Petersburg, setting off the 1905 Russian Revolution, the young Trotsky came with his wife to stay at Parvis's home in Munich, and showed him the manuscript of a pamphlet, to which Parvis added a preface, in which Trotsky developed Parvis's ideas, adding the possibility that revolution in Russia could bring a, quote, "workers' government," end quote, to power. Contrary to the standard Marxist view that Russia would need to go through a phase after the overthrow of the monarchy, which was exercised by a government controlled by the bourgeoisie. This was known as the theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky later acknowledged Parvis's influence over him. Trotsky wrote, quote, "Parvis was unquestionably one of the most important of the Marxists at the turn of the century. Parvis used the Marxian methods skillfully, was possessed of a wide vision, and kept a keen eye on everything of importance in world events. This, coupled with his fearless thinking and his virile muscular style, made Parvis a remarkable writer, ... and yet there was always something made and unreliable about Parvis. In addition to all Parvis's other ambitions, this revolutionary was torn by an amazing desire to get rich." End quote. Trotsky. There were broad discussions on the question of, quote, "permanent revolution," end quote, within the social democratic movement in the period leading up to 1917. In October 1905, Parvis returned to St. Petersburg, where he helped Trotsky take control of the daily paper Russkaya Gazeta, and co-founded with Trotsky and Julius Martov the paper Nachalo, the Start. Arrested in April 1906, Parvis was visited by Rosa Luxemburg in the Peter and Paul fortress. Sentenced to 3 years' exile in Siberia, Parvis escaped and immigrated to Germany, where he published a book about his experience called "In the Russian Bastille During the Revolution." Before he left for Russia, Parvis struck a deal with Maxim Gorky to produce his play The Lower Depths. According to the agreement, the majority of the play's proceeds would go to the Russian Social Democratic Party and approximately 25% to Gorky himself. Parvis's failure to pay, despite the fact that the play had over 500 showings, caused Parvis to be accused of stealing 130,000 German gold marks. Gorky threatened to sue, but Rosa Luxemburg convinced Gorky to keep the quarrel inside the party's own court. Eventually, Parvis paid back Gorky, but his reputation in party circles was damaged. Soon afterwards, Parvis moved to Istanbul in the Ottoman Empire, where Parvis lived for 5 years from 1910 until 1914. There, Parvis set up an arms trading company which profited handsomely during the Balkan War. Parvis became the financial and political advisor of the Committee of Union and Progress. In 1912, Parvis was made editor of Turk Urdu, their daily newspaper. Parvis worked closely with Enver Talat Kemal Pasha and Finance Minister Kaved Bey. Parvis's firm dealt with the deliveries of foodstuffs for the Ottoman army, and he was a business partner of the Krupp concern, of Vickers Limited, and of the famous arms dealer Basil Zaharov. Arms dealings with Vickers Limited at wartime gave basis to the theory that Alexander Parvis was also a British intelligence asset. During his Istanbul period, Parvis also cooperated with the pro-CUP Zionist newspaper, the June Turk, whose editor-in-chief was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. It was like if you don't know, Jabotinsky is like the leader of so-called like revisionist Zionism. While in the Ottoman Empire, Parvis became close to the German ambassador Hans Freiherr von Wangenheim, who was known to be partial to establishing revolutionary fifth columns among the Allies. Consequently, Parvis offered his plan via Baron von Wangenheim to the German General Staff. The paralyzing of Russia via general strike, financed by the German government, which at the time was at war with Russia and its allies. Von Wangenheim sent Parvis to Berlin, where the latter arrived on the 6th of March 1915 and presented a 20-page plan entitled A Preparation of Massive Political Strikes in Russia to the German government. Some accused Parvis of having funded Lenin while in Switzerland. Other authors, however, are skeptical. Charlout and Zeman conclude in their biography of Parvis that there was no cooperation between the two, declaring that, quote, Lenin refused the German offer of aid, end quote. Parvis's bank account shows that he only paid out a total of 25,600 francs in the period between his arrival in Switzerland in May 1915 and the February Revolution of 1917. Parvis did little in Switzerland. Alfred Erich Zen concludes. Austrian intelligence thought Parvis gave money to Russian emigres' newspaper in Paris. However, in the beginning of 1915, the sources of funding became clearer to Lenin and other Paris emigres, whereupon they rejected further support. Harold Schuckman concluded, quote, funds are plainly not flowing into Lenin's hands, end quote. Parvis placed his bets on Lenin, as the latter was not only a radical but willing to accept the sponsorship of the Tsar's wartime enemy, Germany. The two met in Bern in May 1915 and agreed to collaboration through their organizations, though Lenin remained very careful never to get associated with Parvis in public. There is no certain proof that they ever met face to face again, although there are indications that such a meeting may well have occurred on the 13th of April 1917 during Lenin's stopover in Stockholm. Parvis assiduously worked at keeping Lenin's confidence. However, Lenin kept Parvis at arm's length to disguise the changing roles of both men. Parvis's involvement with German intelligence and Parvis's own liaisons with his old ally, who was not respected anymore among the socialists after years in Turkey and after becoming a millionaire entrepreneur. German intelligence set up Parvis's financial network via offshore operations in Copenhagen, setting up relays for German money to get to Russia via fake financial transactions between front organizations. A large part of the transactions of these companies were genuine, but those served to bury the transfer of money to the Bolsheviks, a strategy made feasible by the weak and overburdened fiscal and customs offices in Scandinavia, which were inadequate for the booming black market in these countries during the war. It is still debated whether the money with which this financial network operated was actually of German origin. The evidence published by Alexander Kerensky's government in preparation for a trial scheduled for November 1917 was recently re-examined and found to be either inconclusive or outright forgery. See also Sisson documents. Leon Trotsky responded to allegations that Lenin had colluded with Parvus or German intelligence in his return to St. Petersburg in his History of the Russian Revolution. Parvus died in Berlin on the 12th of December 1924. Parvus's body was cremated and interned in a Berlin cemetery. After his death, Konrad Heinisch wrote in his memoir, quote, "This man possessed the ablest brains of the Second International," unquote. During his lifetime, Alexander Parvus's reputation among his revolutionary peers suffered as a result of the Maxim Gorky affair, see above, and the fact that Maxim Gorky was in effect a German government agent. At the same time, both Parvus's business skills and revolutionary ideas were appreciated and relied upon by Russian and German revolutionaries and Ottoman's Young Turks. After the October Revolution in Russia, for obvious political reasons, Parvus's role was denied and he himself vilified. This continued during Joseph Stalin's era and sometimes had anti-Semitic overtones to it. In Germany, however, Parvus was considered favorably. Bracket, citation needed, and bracket. Parvus's name is often used in modern political debates in Russia. Parvus left no documents after his death, and all his savings disappeared. He was married at least 3 times. In 1906, Rosa Luxemburg wrote Karl Kautsky saying, quote, "Wife number 3 is here in St. Petersburg," end quote. Just after his second wife had fled an anti-Semitic pogrom in Odessa and had arrived in Warsaw destitute. One of Parvus's wives, Tatiana Berman, was born in Odessa in 1868 and died there in 1917, age 49. Their son, Yevgeny, was born in Dresden in 1898. Although the Soviet authorities refused to allow Parvus to return to Russia, both Parvus's surviving sons, Yevgeny Gnedin and Leon Helfand, were allowed to settle in the USSR and became Soviet diplomats. Yevgeny Gnedin was head of the press department of the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. At the time of his arrest on the 11th of May 1939, which coincided with the dismissal of the foreign minister Maxim Litvinov, Yevgeny Gnedin refused to confess, despite being tortured by the police chief Lavrenti Beria and his deputy Bogdan Kubalov. Yevgeny Gnedin survived years in the Gulag and wrote memoirs Catastrophe and Rebirth and Exit from the Labyrinth, describing his experience. He died in 1983. Parvus was portrayed by English actor Michal Go in the 1974 BBC miniseries Fall of Eagles, covering the history of the pre-World War I period. Günter Lemprecht played the title role in the West German TV film Ein Mann namens Parvus, released in 1984. In 1988, Parvus was portrayed by English actor Timothy West in the film Lenin, The Train. A fictionalized version of him as a German Zionist mastermind behind the New World Order is portrayed by the Armenian actor Kevork Malikian in the 2017 Turkish TV series Pey Itat Abdul Hamid, about the struggles and intelligence of the Ottoman Sultan in keeping the declining empire together. Back to the text. Thank you for that detour and footnote. The terms of the theory are familiar to all students of Russian history. In brief, permanent revolution held that in Russia, Because of the, quote, law of uneven development, or, quote, combined development, the workers had become a revolutionary force, while the middle class vacillated and the peasant mass waited for leadership. Consequently, a bourgeois revolution would lead to an uninterrupted development to intervention by the workers to impose their socialist demands. Quote, within the limits of a revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, which is also a bourgeois revolution in its immediate objective aims, there looms up a prospect of an inevitable, or at least possible, supremacy of the working class in the near future. End quote. Trotsky, or Revolution. Inadvertently, in a compound class theory designed for Russia alone, Trotsky had grasped the nature of revolution as an unfolding process leading through various stages. Trotsky's bourgeois revolution corresponded to the moderate phase in the Brentonian model of revolution, and the proletarian takeover corresponded to the extremist phase. Quote, above all, end quote, writes the commentator John Molyneux, a Trotskyist, quote, Trotsky perceived that the revolution was a historical process which, once unleashed, could not be stopped halfway, end quote. John Molyneux, Leon Trotsky's Theory of Revolution. Trotsky furthermore sensed, in the Russian case at least, that the process would temporarily carry extremist politics to a point more advanced than the nation would indefinitely sustain. Therefore, barring external factors, the revolution would inevitably be set back in a step he was later to equate with the Thermidorian reaction. However, Trotsky hoped that defeat for the workers would be averted by a deus ex machina, the international proletarian revolution that Trotsky believed would be triggered in the mature industrial countries by the Russian example. This prognosis gave the uninterrupted or permanent revolution an international dimension as well. Quote, the political emancipation of Russia, led by the working class, will raise that class to a height as yet unknown in history, will make it the initiator of the liquidation of world capitalism, end quote. Footnote, Trotsky, forward to Ferdinand Lassalle's address to the jury, June 1905, quoted in Results and Prospects, in Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution and Results and Prospects, published in London, 1962. End footnote. Such an argument was not Marxism but Russian messianism, but it eventually gave the Bolsheviks of 1917 their theoretical rationale for seizing power. When this particular forecast proved wrong, the communists were left extremely sensitive about the dependence of their political future on revolutionary events abroad. According to Trotsky's theory, the failure to win revolutionary support abroad portended the inevitable decay of the workers' regime in Russia. Coming to terms with this implication was the central problem in Trotsky's later thinking about revolution. Trotsky's theory of permanent or uninterrupted revolution in its internal Russian sense was borne out to an amazing degree by the sequence of revolutionary events in 1917. This is one of the rare historical instances where reality validated theory and was in turn steered by the adherents of the theory. The moderate revolution installed a, quote, bourgeois leadership, but also initiated a revolutionary mobilization of the worker and peasant masses and ended in an extremist takeover, which its beneficiaries chose to style a proletarian revolution. In line with his theory, Trotsky was able to predict in March 1917, quote, the Russian Revolution will not stop, The revolution will make a clean sweep of the bourgeois liberals blocking its way, as it is now making a clean sweep of the Tsarist reaction, end quote. Trotsky. Quoted in Kanai Paz. See also Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. The October Revolution was accomplished by a party explicitly or implicitly sharing the premises of, quote, permanent revolution. Lenin's embrace of this viewpoint was what shocked his followers when he returned to Russia in April 1917, quote, the present situation in Russia, represents a transition from the first stage of the revolution, which, placed the power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to the second stage, which must place the power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorer strata of the peasantry. Lenin, on the tasks of the proletariat in the present revolution. Nikolai Bukharin told the clandestine party Congress in August 1917, quote, "We are going to have a great new upsurge of the revolutionary wave, the declarations of a revolutionary war, But such a revolutionary war will light the fire of world socialist revolution," end quote. Bukharin. Disbelief in the effect of such Russian messianism was what lay behind the opposition of Zinoviev and Kamenev to the armed seizure of power in the October Revolution. Footnote. See Zinoviev and Kamenev's statement to the principal Bolshevik Party organizations from the 11th of October 1917 in Lenin Collected Works, Volume 21, Book 2. End footnote. No modesty inhibited Trotsky from proclaiming his prescience when he wrote shortly afterwards, quote, "The standpoint he, the author Trotsky in 1906, then supported can be outlined as follows. The revolution, having begun as a bourgeois revolution as regards its first tasks, will soon call forth powerful class conflicts and will gain final victory only by transferring power to the only class capable of standing at the head of the oppressed masses, namely to the proletariat." End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Preface to Results and Prospects in The Permanent Revolution and Results and Prospects. The mechanism of this shift Trotsky saw as a suddenly accelerated process of social psychology, going beyond the classic Marxist framework. Quote, "The significance of the revolution lies in the rapid changing of the judgment of the masses, in the fact that new and ever new strata of population acquire experience, verify test their views of the day before, sweep them aside, work out new ones, desert old leaders, and follow new leaders in the forward march." End quote. Trotsky in From October to Brest-Litovsk. Sorry, I was looking up this text. I'm not really seeing anything. The description looks kind of like sketch. End quote Trotsky, or end footnote. Here we go. Trotsky now recognized the same process of a grand, quote, sweep, or, quote, ascending line, at work in the French Revolution, worked out through the politics of, quote, dual power. Quote, "By the steps of the dual power, the French Revolution rises in the course of 4 years to its culmination," end quote. Trotsky. Introduction to Results and Prospects. In the Russian case, Trotsky affirmed the crucial role of the Bolshevik Party and the Bolshevik Party's leadership, including himself, in consummating the extremist victory, but Trotsky conceded later on, quote, "The most favorable conditions for an insurrection exist, obviously, when the maximum shift in our favor has occurred in the relation of forces, in the domain of consciousness," end quote. The party had to grab the crucial moment because, quote, "during revolution, all these processes take place with lightning speed," end quote. Trotsky. Lessons of October. According to Wikipedia, Lessons of October is a polemical essay about 60 printed pages in length by Leon Trotsky, first published in Moscow in October 1924 as the preface to the third volume of his collected works. The essay was harshly critical of the purported revolutionary failings of Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two key members of the collective leadership which briefly ruled Soviet Russia in the months after the death of Vladimir Lenin. Publication of Lessons of October was used as a pretext for the Soviet leadership to isolate and attack Trotsky, whom the leadership mutually perceived as a threat to accede to supreme power. In subsequent years, Trotsky's essay, Lessons of October, was reprinted several times under the Lessons of October's own covers by the international Trotskyist movement. Following a series of strokes which had incapacitated Lenin for more than a year, Soviet leader Lenin died on January 21, 1924, at the age of 53. Despite Lenin's chronic illness, Lenin's premature death nevertheless came as a shock both to the people of the Soviet Union and to the small circle of individuals who collectively ruled in Lenin's stead through the governing Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks and its inner executive committee, the Politburo. A triumvirate wielded effective power from the time of Lenin's second health breakdown in December 1922, which effectively eliminated Lenin's participation in day-to-day operational affairs. This trio included Grigory Zinoviev, a close associate of Lenin's for more than 2 decades, who sat at the head of the Communist International. Zinoviev's co-thinker Lev Kamenev, acting chair of the formal Soviet apparatus, the Council of People's Commissars and secretary of the Politburo, and Joseph Stalin, secretary of the Organization Bureau of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, in charge of party affairs and assignment of party workers to various tasks. Standing aloof from these was the orator and journalist Leon Trotsky, who had returned from North American exile to join the Bolsheviks early in 1917 to be placed in positions of trust at Lenin's right hand. It would ultimately be Trotsky, as the flamboyant chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, who would play a leading role in the October Revolution which brought the Bolshevik Party to power. Stalin would play a lesser and more administrative part. As for Zinoviev and Kamenev, the pair stood aloof from the revolutionary uprising entirely, jointly distancing themselves from a forthcoming Bolshevik seizure of power in the pages of a Menshevik newspaper. This would prove to be a massive miscalculation that would undercut Zinoviev and Kamenev's later efforts to achieve leadership of the Russian Communist Party and the Soviet Republic. All of these four maintained a desire and made active efforts to win for themselves the mantle of leadership. The three old Bolsheviks, Zinoviev, Stalin, and Kamenev, were filled with personal antipathy towards the longtime outsider Trotsky. Each of the four sought to demonstrate the righteousness of their claims, not just through the crass craft of political organization for factional warfare, but also through theoretical acumen. Each began the feverish publication of new works of sociology or Marxist theory, or collected their contemporary journalism in an effort to prove themselves able theoreticians. Trotsky, in an effort to prove his credentials as a theoretician, even launched a multi-volume publishing project for the release of his collected works involving the state publishing house. It would be this publishing effort amidst this highly personalized faction fight that would lead to the publication of the polemical essay, Lessons of October. On January 18, 1925, a plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks was called to address the so-called Trotsky question. Feeling isolated and discredited among the top leadership, Trotsky decided to resign his position as People's Commissar of War rather than to attempt to marshal his forces for a hopeless fight at the Central Committee plenum. In a lengthy letter of resignation, Trotsky explicitly denied that Lessons of October had been published furtively or that it represented a, quote, platform for a formal opposition faction as his detractors contended. Quote, insofar as a formal pretext for the latest discussion was found in the foreword to my book on 1917, I consider it my duty, first of all, to refute the accusation that I had published the book without the knowledge of the Central Committee. In point of fact, this book was printed during my rest cure in the Caucasus, exactly in the same way as all other books written by me or by any members of the Central Committee or of the party. Of course, it is the business of the Central Committee to establish some form of control over party publications, and I had never had cause or inclination to avoid such control. End quote. Trotsky. Quote, the foreword on Lessons of October contains the development of those ideas which I have expressed before and especially during the last year. ... It goes without saying that in analyzing the October Revolution in connection with German events, I never dreamed of creating a separate, quote, platform, or ever entertained the idea that my work would be interpreted in that sense, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's resignation was unanimously accepted by the Central Committee at the January 18th session, which Trotsky did not attend. Efforts there by Zinoviev and Kamenev to remove Trotsky from the Politburo and expel Trotsky from the party were turned aside, however. The resolution passed by the Central Committee on the 18th of January demanded that Trotsky demonstrate, quote, submission to party discipline, not only in words but also in deeds, end quote, to issue an unconditional renunciation of his criticisms, and threatened his removal from Communist Party leadership in the event he made, quote, new attempts to violate or fail to carry out, end quote, party decisions. A campaign to, quote, enlighten the party and the non-party population about the purported anti-Bolshevik nature of Trotskyism was announced. Back to the text. Throughout the violent period of civil war, terror, and utopian experiment from 1918 to 1921, known appropriately as war communism, Trotsky continued to view the struggle as a validation of his theory and the theory as a justification of the revolutionary dictatorship. Quote, the events in which we are now participating, end quote, Trotsky wrote in 1919, quote, and even our methods of participating in them were foreseen in their fundamental lines from 15 years ago. Some 15 years ago, end quote. Trotsky. Introduction to Results and Prospects. Critics of Bolshevik extremism, notably the Mensheviks and Western Social Democrats like Karl Kautsky, were, as far as Trotsky was concerned, traitors to the working class. In Trotsky's theoretical scheme of revolution, no distinction could be made between the sequence of class stages, from bourgeois to proletarian, and the sequence of revolutionary methods, from moderate to extremist. Quote, the question as to who is to rule the country, i.e. of the life or death of the bourgeoisie, will be decided on either side, not by references to the paragraphs of the Constitution, but by the employment of all forms of violence. End quote. Trotsky, Terrorism and Communism. Trotsky was convinced that everything the Bolshevik regime did was necessitated by the circumstance of a workers' government in Russia struggling to hold against all the forces of bourgeois reaction until the world revolution would itself be triggered by that struggle. With the failure of world revolution to materialize after the high hopes of 1919, and the crystallization of powerful opposition, especially peasant, to the regime of war communism, the Bolshevik leadership was faced with the necessity of a fundamental reconsideration, not only of the tactics of their regime, but of its fundamental theoretical rationale. Up to this point, messianic notions about the international impact of their revolutionary example had spared them from hard thoughts about the later course of the revolution. The later course of the revolution. But Trotsky had given a clear warning back in 1906 of what would happen to the workers' government if the world revolution should somehow fail them. As Trotsky recognized in retrospect, quote, war communism had exhausted itself. Agriculture, and with it, everything else had arrived in a blind alley. ... It was a crisis of the whole system of war communism, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Trotsky's letter to the Bureau of Party History concerning the falsification of the history of the October Revolution, the history of the revolution, and the history of the party, published in the Stalin School of Falsification. According to Wikipedia, the Stalin School of Falsification is a book written in 1937 by Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, written after Trotsky's expulsion from the Soviet Union. The book contains a detailed account of how historians chosen by Joseph Stalin rewrote revolutionary history. A well-known example from the book concerns the revolutionary contributions by Trotsky himself, about which Stalin had written glowingly in 1918, but whose special value he denied by 1924. A translation in English by Max Shachtman was published in 1937 by Pioneer Publishers. In 1974, New Park in London published another edition. Back to the text and footnote. The outcome, of course, was the new economic policy, which Lenin introduced in 1921 with the concurrence of the entire party leadership, including Trotsky. The transition to the new economic policy made immediate the question of where the revolutionary process would lead after the period of Jacobin Bolshevik extremism. To certain outside observers, the trend was clear. With the new economic policy of 1921 began Russia's Thermidor. What the hell is his name? I've already forgot his name. Is it Chance Brinton? Crane Brinton. Excuse me. Where the hell am I? To certain outside observers, the trend was clear. With the new economic policy of 1921 began Russia's Thermidor, end quote. Crane Brinton wrote. The main anomaly was that this, quote, strategic retreat, end quote, as Lenin called it, from the pinnacle of revolutionary zeal was self-executed, not imposed by a coup d'etat. The Mensheviks, including Martov, immediately recognized the Thermidorian parallel. Footnote. See Simon Wolin, The Mensheviks Under the NEP and in Emigration, in the book The Mensheviks, From the Revolution of 1917 to the Second World War, edited by Leopold Hameson, published in Chicago, 1917. And the article by J. Bergman titled The Perils of Historical Analogy, Trotsky on the French Revolution. I think I have that downloaded and ready to read. I don't know if I have this book. This Mensheviks book that I'm looking up now. I don't know if I have an available description. The AI overview. Says, The Mensheviks from the Revolution of 1917 to the Second World War is a book edited by Leopold H. Hameson, which delves into the history of the Menshevik political party in Russia, focusing on their experiences from the 1917 revolution through the end of World War II, providing detailed analysis of their struggles against the rising power of the Bolsheviks and their eventual exile or suppression under Soviet rule. Again, that's an AI overview, so take it for what you will. Back to the text and footnote. Kautsky, whose writings as a publicist seem more insightful than his theorizing, even predicted such a self-initiating shift. Writing as early as 1919, quote, Lenin's government is threatened by by another ninth Thermidor. ... In some other way, ... It is not impossible that the collapse of the communist experiment in Russia may not equally transform the Bolsheviks and save them as a governing party, ... The Bolsheviks have developed the art of adaptation to circumstances in the course of their rule to a remarkable degree, end quote. Kautsky, Terrorism and Communism, A Contribution to the Natural History Revolution. The most particular thing about the Soviet Thermidor was the inability of the Soviet leadership to recognize their own move for what it was, despite or perhaps because of their identification with the Jacobins. At that point, they could still see Thermidor only in terms of the violent overthrow of the Radical Party by outright counter-revolutionaries. Only when he found himself slipping out of the inner circle as the succession struggle began in 1923 did Trotsky awaken, and then not to a Thermidor already accomplished, but only to the possibility of, quote, Thermidorian influences, end quote. Footnote. First expressed by Trotsky as far as can be determined in a pamphlet of early 1923 titled Thoughts on the Party. End footnote. In Trotsky's slashing attack on the party leadership in late 1923, particularly in Trotsky's New Course articles, Trotsky called for a campaign to preserve the revolutionary spirit against the encroachment of, quote, bureaucratism, and warned, quote, the internal social contradictions of the revolution, which were automatically compressed under war communism, ... under the new economic policy, unfold unfailingly and seek to find political expression, end quote. According to Menshevik predictions of an anti-Bolshevik coup comparable to the overthrow of Robespierre, Trotsky insisted that the Russian Revolution still had its strong proletarian base with peasant support and would be sustained by a, quote, inevitable extension of the revolution, end quote, throughout Europe. Nevertheless, he warned that a recrudescence of capitalistic elements under the new economic policy could lead to, quote, either the direct overthrow of the Workers' Party or its progressive degeneration, end quote. Trotsky, The New Course. Trotsky's hint of a possible Thermidorian tendency within the communist regime were particularly galling to the leadership, who sought some way of countering Trotsky in the arena of theory as well as by direct political pressure. One result was Stalin's celebrated, quote, theory of socialism in one country, end quote, designed to argue with appropriately called quotations from Lenin that the Soviet regime was in no danger of losing its proletarian purity because it did not, after all, need the world revolution in order to hold out in Russia as a genuine workers' state. Footnote, see Robert V. Daniels, The Conscience of the Revolution. End footnote. Another tactic was to turn French revolutionary analogy against Trotsky by accusing Trotsky, as Commissar of War, of representing a threat of Bonapartism. This charge served to justify Trotsky's removal from that strategic post in 1925. In 1926 and 1927, after Trotsky had allied himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev for the last-ditch fight against Stalin and Bukharin, Trotsky responded to the growing repression of opposition with more and more shrill charges against the party leadership. At the same time, he expressed a new pessimism about the revolutionary process, In a diary entry of November 1926, Trotsky noted, quote, "Revolutions have always in history been followed by counter-revolutions. Counter-revolutions have always thrown society back, but never as far back as the starting point of the revolution," end quote. Accordingly, quote, "In a sense, the hopes engendered by the revolution are always exaggerated. This is due to the mechanics of class society, ... The conquests gained in the struggle do not correspond in the nature of things, do not correspond, and in the nature of things cannot directly correspond with the expectations of the broad backward masses," end quote. Trotsky. Here was the extraordinary admission by Trotsky that all revolutions are naturally premature in relation to the availability of resources to carry out their promises. Revolution could outrun its base thanks to temporary political momentum. Quote, "The awakening of the broad backward masses upsets the ruling classes from their accustomed equilibrium, deprives them of direct support as well as confidence, and thus enables the revolution to seize a great deal more than it is later able to hold," end quote. But the backswing was sooner or later hard to escape. Quote, "The disillusionment of these masses, their return to routine and futility is ... an integral part of the post-revolutionary period," end quote. Trotsky. Theses on Revolution and Counter-Revolution, first published in the Fourth International, October 1941, reprinted in Isaac Deutscher, The Age of Permanent Revolution, a Trotsky anthology. I'm going to look this book up. Yeah, not seeing any descriptions of that book. Anyway, end footnote. This new fatalistic sense of the revolutionary process Trotsky tried to throw in the teeth of the party leadership during his last stand before expulsion and exile. Defending himself before the pro-Stalin Central Control Commission in the summer of 1927, Trotsky invoked the full cycle of the French revolutionary model. Quote, "In the Great French Revolution, there were two great chapters, of which one went like this, bracket, points upward, end bracket, and the others like that, and the other like that, bracket, points downward, end bracket. When the chapter heads like this, upwards, the French Jacobins, the Bolsheviks of that time, guillotined the Royalists and the Girondists. We too have had a similar great chapter when we ... shot the White Guards and exiled the Girondists. And then there began another chapter in France, when the French Ustrylovs and semi-Ustrylovs, the Thermidorians and Bonapartists from among the right-wing Jacobins, began exiling and shooting the left Jacobins, the Bolsheviks of the time," end quote. Footnote, a reference to N.V. Ustryalov, an emigre Russian economist who had hailed the NEP as a return to capitalism. End footnote. I'm looking up this person right now. Nikolai Vasilyevich Ustryalov lived from 1890 to 1937, was a Russian politician and a leading pioneer of National Bolshevism. His great-uncle was Nikolai Gerasimovich Ustryalov. Ustryalov and many of his followers were later charged with counter-revolutionary activity and executed during the Great Purge. Ustrayalov was born in St. Petersburg. Ustrayalov graduated in law from Moscow University in 1913, teaching at Moscow University. Ustrayalov was initially a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party. Ustrayalov belonged to a tendency of Slavophile intellectuals, although from early on he departed from his contemporaries by being less enthusiastic about the Eastern Orthodox Church than the likes of Sergei Bulgakov and Peter Bernardovich Struve. Nikolai Ustrayalov was a supporter of the, quote, whites in the Russian Civil War. So he started out as a supporter of the whites in the Russian Civil War and saw service under the command of Alexander Kolchak. However, Ustrayalov changed his views towards a fusion of nationalism with Bolshevism, with the new communism presented as the best hope for reestablishing Russia as an international power. Among Ustrayalov's written works were contributions to, quote, The Problems of Great Russia and, quote, Morning to Russia, two pre-Bolshevik journals in which Nikolai Ustrayalov called for unity amongst the Slavs and rejoiced in the overthrow of Tsarist rule. In exile, Nikolai Ustrayalov founded the journal Okno Window with other dissidents in the 1921, published his seminal collection of articles titled Change of Landmarks, in which he expounded his theories of nationalism, and that gave rise to a weekly magazine, Smena Vek. The main ideologue of the Smenovetsy, as his followers became known, Nikolai Ustrayalov urged written works such as the piece In the Struggle for Russia, published in 1920, and Under the Sign of Revolution, published in 1925, to argue against the views of Struve. Claiming to be inspired by figures such as General Alexei Brusilov and Vladimir Purishkevich, both of whom had said they would serve the Bolsheviks in the interest of Russia, Ustrayalov called for a reconciliation with the Soviet Union, as it was only the Bolsheviks who could guarantee Russia's security. With the introduction of the new economic policy, Ustrayalov saw a process of, quote, normalization beginning in the Soviet Union, and argued that increasingly the USSR was, quote, like a radish, end quote, in that the USSR was red on the outside but white on the inside. Ustrayalov did not consider himself a communist, rejecting the ideology as a foreign import, but Ustrayalov began to use the term, quote, national Bolshevik after discovering it in the writings of German dissident Ernst Niekisch. Despite Ustrayalov's enthusiasm, Ustrayalov was dismissed as an enemy by Vladimir Lenin and lived in exile in Harbin, Manchuria. Here he worked as an advisor at the China Far East Railway. Bracket citation needed. Nikolai Ustrayalov was dean of the Faculty of Law at Harbin from 1920 until 1924. With attitudes towards national Bolshevism having thawed under Stalin, bracket citation needed, end bracket, Ustrayalov was able to return to the Soviet Union in 1935. Trotsky regarded the forces that gathered around Ustrayalov as not wanting Russia to return to a state of semi-colonial dependence on Western capitalism, and therefore anti-capitalist without being the least bit socialist. According to Trotsky, Ustrayalov and his followers foresaw the conversion of the Soviet state into a normal bourgeois state and believed that this state should be supported. Ustrayalov's past as a white counted against him, however, and Ustrayalov struggled to find employment or even acceptance as a Soviet citizen in Moscow. Eventually, Nikolai Ustrayalov was sent to a gulag. In 1937, during the Great Purge, Nikolai Ustryalov was arrested on charges of espionage and, quote, anti-Soviet agitation. On September 14th, 1937, Ustryalov was sentenced to death and executed on the same day. Back to the text and footnote. Reshaping his notion of Thermidor as a mere retreat, not a rout, Trotsky observed, quote, "It is thought that the Thermidorians were errant counter-revolutionaries, conscious supporters of the monarchic rule, and so on. Nothing of the kind. The Thermidorians were Jacobins, with this difference, that they had moved to the right." End quote. Trotsky, the Stalin School of Falsification. In Marxist terms, for Trotsky, the situation in Russia was simple. Quote, Thermidor, is a departure from the rails of the proletarian revolution to the petty bourgeois rails, end quote, opportunistically condoned by the revolutionary leadership themselves. Footnote, quote, the real situation in Russia and the tasks of the... Okay, never mind, that's not a... That's a title, it's not a quote. The piece, The Real Situation in Russia and the Tasks of the Communist Party, opposition platform of September 1927, in Trotsky, The Real Situation in Russia, published in New York in 1928. End footnote. I'm looking up right now The Real Situation in Russia by Trotsky, but my internet seems to not want to work, so hopefully it'll start working soon. Trotsky was a theorist who did his most creative work under the immediate impact of events around him. When Trotsky first formulated permanent revolution, and on through his initial perception of the revolution in decline, Trotsky made no effort to extend his theory to countries other than Russia. It was the abortive communist bid for power in China in 1927, first in alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, and then against them, that prompted Trotsky to universalize his process concept. Trotsky wrote in April 1927, just before Chiang turned against the Chinese communists, of, quote, an alliance of workers and peasants under the leadership of the proletariat, end quote, and foresaw a, quote, possibility of the democratic revolution growing over into the socialist revolution, end quote, while the Soviet Union would play the role of outside ally envisaged for the Western proletariat in the original Russian version of permanent revolution. Footnote. See Trotsky, Class Relations in the Chinese Revolution, published 3rd of April 1927 in the New International. And published in the New International, March 1938. Where am I? By extension, this situation made permanent revolution the general model for underdeveloped and colonial countries. Footnote. See Curtis Stokes, The Evolution of Trotsky's Theory of Revolution. I'm not seeing any description for that book. The description for The Real Situation in Russia by Leon Trotsky says, The Real Situation in Russia, first published in 1928, contains three of Trotsky's harshest rebuttals of Stalin's takeover of the Russian Revolution following the death of Lenin. The first part contains a defense of the opposition platform against the Stalinist denunciation. The second details Trotsky's view of the precise nature of the Stalinist program, as well as its disastrous consequences for Russia. And the third demonstrates the unashamed falsification of the history by Stalin with regard to the beginning of the revolution. In a sympathetic but nonetheless astute introduction to Trotsky's argument by the translator, the Real Situation in Russia will prove to be of value to all students of 20th century Marxism, and in particular those interested in the Russian Revolution, not only its origins and early developments, but also perhaps the reasons for its ultimate failure. The contents of the Real Situation in Russia include Part 1, The Fear of Our Platform, Part 2, The Real Situation in Russia and the Tasks of the Communist Party, Introduction by Max Eastman, The Situation of the Working Class and the Trade Unions, The Agrarian Question and the Socialist Construction, State Industry and the Building of Socialism, The Soviets, The National Question, The Party, The League of Communist Youth, Our International Situation and the War Danger, The Red Army and the Red Fleet, As to the Real and Pretend Disagreements, Against Opportunism for the Unity of the Party. Part 3, Stalin Falsifies History. The War and My Arrival in Petrograd. Raskolnikov's Two Opinions. May to October 1917. My Part in the October Revolution. Quote, Lost Documents. The Two Opinions of Yaroslavsky. The Two Opinions of Olminsky and Lunacharsky. The Debates about Brest-Litovsk and the Trade Unions. With Lenin in the International. Lenin and Trotsky on the Peasant Question. My Military Work. The Most Contemptible Lie of the Stalinists. The Blanket Endorsement of Lenin. The Lie about Militarization of Labor. My Solidarity with Lenin in the Industrial Work. After Lenin's Illness. Government Planning. With Lenin against Stalin. With Lenin against Stalin, Rykov, Kalinin, and Bukharin. My Last Talk with Lenin. Lenin broke conclusively with Stalin. A few conclusions. Supplements. The Testament of Lenin. The Last Words of Adolf Joffe. Stalin, Bukharin, and the Chinese Revolution. A comment of French communists on the situation in Russia. The deportation of Trotsky. Appeal of the Russian opposition to the Communist International. Back to the text. The Italian scholar Pier Paolo Poggio comments, quote, For Trotsky in Russia and in general in backward countries, the seizure of power by the consciously organized proletariat ... will be easier and quicker than in the advanced capitalist countries, end quote. There's something in Italian by Pier Paolo Poggio in the footnotes. Incorporating this perspective into his polemical reformulation of permanent revolution in 1928, Trotsky presented what Les Evans and Russell Bloch term, quote, the theory of permanent revolution as we know it today, as a general theory of the necessity of socialist revolution in the colonial world. End quote. See Les Evans and Russell Bloch's edited volume, Leon Trotsky on China. I'm going to look that book up. It says, the description just says, articles and letters on the Chinese Revolution of the 1920s, recording the fight to reverse Stalin's disastrous course of subordinating the Communist Party there to an alliance with the capitalist Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. Back to the text. Trotsky, the defense, back to the text, End footnote. The radical new departures undertaken by Stalin after Trotsky's defeat, including his break with the communist right wing and the initiation of intensive industrialization and collectivization, threw his critics into a new theoretical quandary. At first, Trotsky was inclined to describe the Stalin revolution as a, quote, prolonged zigzag to the left, end quote, compelled somehow by pressure from the workers and the left opposition, but still under the pull of the, quote, Thermidorian bureaucracy. Footnote, see Trotsky's article, The Defense of the Soviet Republic and the Opposition, published in 1929. End footnote. Quote, Stalinism is inverted Kerenskyism, end quote, Trotsky suggested. Quote, on the road to Thermidor, the last form of the rule of the proletariat, end quote. Trotsky. By now, the trend of the new economic policy years was clear to him. Quote, a period of reaction can occur not only after a bourgeois revolution, but after a proletarian revolution as well. For 6 years we have been living in the USSR under conditions of mounting reaction against October, paving the way for Thermidor, end quote. Trotsky. To his supporters in Italy, Trotsky wrote, quote, when we speak of Thermidor, we may have in mind the creeping counter-revolution which is being prepared in a massed way and which is being accomplished in several stages, end quote. Trotsky, letter to the Italian left communists, 25th of September 1929. With the perspective of an additional half-decade, Trotsky was more uncertain about the retrograde course of the Russian Revolution. Quote, Stalin, is a living embodiment of a bureaucratic Thermidor, end quote. Looking back from the year 1935, Trotsky concluded, quote, today it is impossible to overlook, the fact, that in the Soviet Revolution, also a shift to the right took place a long time ago, a shift entirely analogous to Thermidor, although much slower in tempo and more massed in form, The year 1924, that was the beginning of the Soviet Thermidor, end quote. See Trotsky's article, The Worker State and the Question of Thermidor and Bonapartism, published in New International in 1935. And in Trotsky, The Class Nature of the Soviet State. End footnote. Where the hell am I? Thus, Trotsky finally recognized that the Thermidor had in fact occurred not as an overt bourgeois coup, but as a more subtle political shift within the ruling party. Trotsky's only trouble was that he persisted, for reasons of his own self-justification, in placing the shift 3 years beyond the real turning point of 1921. Simultaneously, with his recognition of the Russian Thermidor, Trotsky was compelled to admit the possibility of a further post-revolutionary phase, distinct from Thermidor, which was still not clearly a counter-revolution. In the French model, this was the era of Bonapartism. Thermidor, in this context, was, quote, a transitory phase between Jacobinism and Bonapartism, end quote. Trotsky, On the Question of Thermidor and Bonapartism, published November 1930. Stalin naturally became the embodiment of this last stage of the revolutionary process. Russia was thereby observing the laws demonstrated in the, quote, consecutive stages of the Great French Revolution during its rise and fall alike, end quote. Though Trotsky still endeavored to describe these stages as a sequence of distinct class elements, quote, in the successive supremacy of Mirabeau, Brissot, Robespierre, Barras, and Bonaparte, there is an obedience to objective law incomparably more effective than the special traits of the historic protagonists themselves, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. For a Marxist, Trotsky had an unusually supple understanding of history in general and of revolution in particular. While wedded to the usual class categories of political explanation, he was able to grasp the complexities of a phenomena such as revolution that in fact transcended the Marxian mode of analysis. He attempted a running explanation of unfolding developments in Russia by applying a process conception and extending it as new stages appeared. This was more than a mere analogy, though it was expressed in French revolutionary terminology. Constantly attempting to use his understanding of the revolutionary process as a political weapon, Trotsky did not always react at once to a new stage, notably Thermidor and the rise of post-revolutionary dictatorship. In time, however, Trotsky was able to set the realities of these phenomena in Russia into the framework of his model. Quote, revolution itself is neither a single nor a harmonious process, end quote, Trotsky wrote in 1931. Quote, revolution is full of contradictions. Revolution unfolds only by taking one step back after taking two steps forward. Revolution in its own turn sweeps into power a new ruling stratum which strives to secure its privileged position, end quote. Here was a hint of the, quote, new class, end quote, theory. Finally, Trotsky called the whole Marxian logic into question, quote, the epochs of ideological reaction which, more than once in history, have run parallel with economic successes, engender the need for revising revolutionary ideas and methods and create their own conventional line, end quote. Trotsky, The Stalin School of Falsification, forward to the 1931 Russian edition. That's the end of this article. Thank you so much for listening.